okay? Because we're going live right now.
Perfect. All right, I believe that we should both be live. And I'm just going to talk for a second. David, thank you so much for having me back on your show. Also, welcome to my show. This is kind of a episode of Conversations with Catholics. It's kind of an episode of Catholic Versus, and it's kind of a debate too. It's got like an informal structure to it. But I'm really excited to be talking to you today. So thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, I'm really excited, and I want to give a shout out to our friend Christopher Rice, CJ Rice. He was on my podcast. There he is.
There he is.
He was on your podcast, and he really hooked this up. So thanks. Shout out to you, Christopher.
Yep. Thanks, CJ. And real quick, I'll just say hi to Gloff. I don't know if Gloff is here yet. I think he left that comment a little bit ago. But when you tune in later, Gloff, what's up? Thanks for being here. Okay, so just to let the audience know, we have a informal structure for how this debate is going to go, and I'm even putting the word debate in air quotes because I think that this is unusual as far as debates go, probably a lot less formal than like a real debate. But I've prepared an opening statement in which I am defending a premise, and that premise is it is reasonable to not be Catholic for philosophical reasons. So in that opening statement, I have 3 different reasons for why I think that this is like a reasonable thing that reasonable people can do. I'm going to go for roughly 15 minutes, and then I'm going to give David 15 minutes to kind of give whatever kind of remarks that he has on that, and or more than 15 minutes, it doesn't matter. But I'll just make sure that I'm quiet and respectful so that, since David is giving me this 15-minute opening. And then after that, it's just going to be a normal episode where we go back and forth, and we'll do audience Q&A. And it should be a good time. So what's up, dry apologists? So if anybody has questions for me during my opening statement, go ahead and leave them in the chat. I'm not going to pull them up during my opening statement. I'm not going to pull them up during David's part either, but we'll pull them up after. And maybe we might do a formal Q&A session after the cross-examination. We might just kind of pull them into during it. How'd I do there, David? Was that a pretty good summary of what we're doing today?
Yeah, excellent.
Okay, awesome. I am going to pull up my opening statement, and then I am going to get started. Okay, so today's prompt is, it is reasonable to reject Catholicism on philosophical grounds, for which I am taking the affirmative. I will argue in my opening statement and then in the following open dialogue and Q&A that it is reasonable to reject Catholicism on philosophical grounds. What exactly do I mean by this? What I mean is that I'll argue that the Catholic Church commits her members to certain philosophical positions, and that a reasonable person can reject those philosophical positions. I'd like to start off by explaining what I am not arguing. I am not arguing that all reasonable people will reject Catholicism. I think that there are a ton of very reasonable Catholics, from Catholic talk show hosts like David here on Catholic Versus, to Matt Fradd and Thursday on the Pints with Aquinas team, to Anthony and Rob from Avoiding Babylon, who I know you've had on your show, David, and some of my favorite Catholic apologists, Kyle Whittington, Trent Horn, Jimmy Aiken, some Catholic PhD philosophers like Dr. Jim Madden, priests like Father Brown, who I've had on my show, and priests like the priests at my very chapel that I attended growing up. I think that all of these Catholics that I've listed here, and obviously tons more, are very rational people. The Church has a rich philosophical history. Obviously, Aquinas is a giant of medieval philosophy, but people like William of Ockham, who I will be leaning on in this debate, were also Catholic. If I wanted to argue that no Catholics are reasonable, I wouldn't be able to use like any of the sources that I'm citing for my opening statement. So that's what I am not arguing, that no Catholics are reasonable. That's certainly not the case. But what am I arguing? Essentially, I'm arguing that I think that more people than there currently are should be agnostic. I do understand the philosophical positions that I'm going to argue against. At least I think that I understand them. And I reject them anyway. I think that I'm a rational person. At least I hope so. And I think that rational people can wind up on either side of these 3 topics that I'm going to bring up. Okay, So what is the first of those three topics that I'm going to bring up? If anybody knows my work, nobody will be surprised by this first one. That is nominalism. Nominalism is the belief that universals do not exist. This is in contrast to realism. And realism is just the belief that universals do exist. And sorry, I think that most Catholics today are realists. Specifically, they are realists like Aquinas, that is to say, moderate realists. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into the difference between moderate realism and Platonism. I think it's just safe to say here, realists think that universals exist, nominalists don't. So what are universals? Well, first, mankind is a universal. Substances are universals. And the Council of Trent relies on substances and how it couches transubstantiation. So I see some tensions between nominalism and Catholicism right there at the Council of Trent. Now, the Jesuits have done some pretty cool work in trying to understand the real presence without transubstantiation, strictly speaking. But I think that there's a worse problem for the Catholic nominalist, and I think that would be natures. Natures are another universal. The Catholic nominalist would be somebody who says, yeah, natures don't exist, but also Jesus has two natures, the human nature and the divine. But that just seems like it can't be done, I think. Like, I don't know how somebody can be both a Catholic and a nominalist. So if that's the case, then there's tension here, right? So, okay. So we've established that the Catholic probably can't be a nominalist. But I'm not just saying that nominalists can't be Catholic. I'm saying rational people can reject Catholicism based on philosophical grounds. So why would a rational person be a nominalist? Let's discuss that real quick. So I'm going to lean heavily on the article called Nominalism and Metaphysics, first published in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy back in 2008, but it's available for free online. So if you just Google Nominalism and Metaphysics, the SEP, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is probably going to come up. Okay. One argument against postulating abstract objects or universals or abstracta, it's all the same thing, is based on Occam's razor. I said I'd bring Occam up again. According to this principle, one should not multiply entities or kinds of entities unnecessarily. Thus, if one can show that certain concrete objects can perform all the theoretical roles usually associated with abstract objects, one should refrain from postulating abstract objects. The effectiveness of this appeal to Occam's razor is, of course, conditional upon us having shown that concrete objects can play all the same roles as the abstract objects, but I'll argue that they can. And in fact, most realists agree that they can. Most realists agree abstract objects are causally inert. Back to the SEP article, another common and widely discussed argument against abstract objects is an epistemological argument. The argument is grounded in the thought that, given that abstract objects are causally inert, it is difficult to understand how we can have knowledge or reliable belief about them. Admittedly, these arguments do not establish nominalism, but they do establish some kind of explanatory lacuna. A lacuna is a word that means an unfilled space or gap in realism. The challenge for the realist is to explain how knowledge of and reference to abstract objects is even possible if those abstract objects are causally inert. And it's also worth pointing out that some of the most famous deniers of abstract objects, some of the most famous nominalists, have not even based their nominalism on arguments at all. That is the case, for instance, for Goodman and Quine, who, in their steps towards a constructive nominalism, based their rejection of mathematical objects on basic intuition, and this was back in the 1940s. Other well-known nominalists include people like Francis Bacon, David Hume, and John Stuart Mill. Also, according to the Canadian philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, who actually just passed away, I think, earlier this year, most of science, contemporary science, I should say, is motivated by an unstated nominalistic metaphysical worldview. Okay, I do know that nominalism requires the nominalist to bite some bullets, and I fully expect to get into that in the dialogue and then the Q&A. But for now, let me move on to point number 2. Point number 2 is mereological nihilism. Mereological nihilism is the denial of composite objects. And I'm going to follow the same format here as I did the first one. First of all, why is this incompatible with the Catholic Church? And then secondly, why would a rational person hold this view. So consider a universe in which the only thing that exists is composite object X, and I'm putting composite object X in air quotes because the mereological nihilist would deny composite objects, and composite object X is composed of simple parts A, B, and C. The mereological non-nihilist would say 4 things exist: A, B, and C, and X, because X is the composite object of A, B, and C. The mereological nihilist would say, no, only 3 things exist: A, B, and C. And sure, A, B, and C exist in some kind of arrangement, and we call that arrangement X, but X isn't a thing with any real existence. That's the difference between the two. I'm going to argue that you cannot be both a mereological nihilist and Catholic. Why? Because of Catechism of the Catholic Church, entry 364, in which the CCC defines what it is to be man. Man is a composite object, specifically a composite of body and soul. I'm going to quote CCC 364. The human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. It is a human body precisely because it is an animated spiritual soul, and it is the whole human person that is intended to become, in the body of Christ, a temple of the Spirit. Man, though made of body and soul, is a unity. It goes on, but I think that last sentence there was the important part. In Catholicism, there appears to be like a true self, and the self is composite. The body alone is composite too. Let's not, forget that. But suffice to say that the body and the soul put together is certainly a composite object. And that's what man is, according to the Catholic Church. The mereological nihilist denies the existence of the self, strictly speaking. So it seems to me that somebody cannot be both Catholic and a mereological nihilist. Okay, but why would a reasonable person be a mereological nihilist? Well, for this, I'm going to lean heavily on an essay titled "Against Apartheid" by Ted Sider. The argument that Sider lays out in this work is an argument from parsimony. It is simply simpler to be a nihilist about mereology. Sider spends pretty much the rest of his essay shooting down objections to mereological nihilism. Sider argues against the intuition that composite objects exist, saying that intuitions can be and often are wrong. He argues against the perception objection, saying that really what we are perceiving is the mereological symbols arranged XYs. We're not perceiving X directly. He argues against the notion that we are required to believe that composite objects exist because, well, we exist and we're mereological and we are composite, by simply saying, no, what we are is a collection of symbols arranged us-wise. The best thing that I think that the Catholic can do in terms of the mereology debate is to take the Van Inwagen approach. Van Inwagen was actually Ted Sider's professor too, so it's just kind of like a funny little thing to note there. And Van Inwagen was like this close to being a mereological nihilist, but he wasn't. Van Inwagen argued that the only real composite objects that exist are the organics. I don't accept this, since it seems like special pleading to me. Also, because the vagueness of the category of life seems like a problem here. When does something get like caught up in life? So consider like a cat that like takes a breath and it inhales like some oxygen, and that oxygen is eventually going to like enter the cat's bloodstream and stuff like that. But at what moment does that part of that oxygen molecule become part of the cat's body? That kind of seems arbitrary to me. So I don't accept that. However, I do like where Van Inwagen is going with this. And I think that that's like a really, if I were to try to marry mereological nihilism with Catholicism, because I was convinced that both were true, I would be looking really heavily into Van Inwagen's work. Okay, that was the second. The last thing that I'm going to talk about today is teleology. Teleology is the fourth and final of Aristotle's four causes in his physics. Notice that I said physics, not metaphysics, because Aristotle never used the word physics. He never used the word metaphysics. He just used the word physics. The word teleology comes from telos, meaning end or aim or goal, and then logos, meaning explanation or reason. And Aristotle argued that one of the reasons that an acorn grows into a tree is because an acorn has the telos of to grow into an acorn tree. Catholicism relies on teleology heavily, I will argue, especially for sexual ethics. The reason why like gay relationships are wrong is because all non-procreative sexual acts are wrong. And so, of course, like gay acts are going to be necessarily non-procreative. Why are non-procreative acts wrong? Because it frustrates the telos of the act, or at least it frustrates one of the teloi of the act, teloi being plural of telos. But I reject teleology, as does the vast majority. Well, vast is going to be a contentious word here, but I will say most philosophically inclined scientists today do reject teleology. This has been happening for hundreds of years, I will argue, this move away from teleology. I'm going to quote M.R. Johnson's 2008 work, Aristotle on Teleology, published in the Oxford University Press, pages 23 and 24, when he says, the received intellectual tradition has it that in the 16th and 17th century, so like, almost 500 years at this point, revolutionary philosophers began to curtail and reject the teleology of the medieval and scholastic Aristotelians, abandoning final causation in favor of a purely mechanistic model of the universe. Wikipedia puts the dividing line for teleology at the work Novum Organum by Francis Bacon, saying that since the publication of that work in 1620, teleological explanations in physical science tend to be deliberately avoided in favor of material and efficient causes, to put it still in the Aristotelian language. But teleological language does still hold some sway today, particularly in biology. Biologists will use teleological language to describe bodily functions. The heart's purpose is to pump blood. And in evolution, the heart evolved to pump blood. But I will argue that many philosophically inclined biologists will say that this is simply an example of, quote, speaking with the vulgar. Vulgar not meaning like curse words, vulgar meaning the vulgate, the common folk. There's an article called The Teleology, the explanation that bedevils biology, again, published in the Oxford University Press, 2004, that begins like this. Biology is sick. Fundamentally unscientific modes of thought are increasingly accepted and dominate the way the subject is explained to the next generation. The heart of the problem is that we persist in making, literally then in brackets, making sense of a world in which we now know to be senseless by attributing subjective values to the objects within it, values that have no basis in reality. So we reject teleology thanks to parsimony, again, shaving it off using Occam's razor. There's simply no need to posit it, so we don't. In conclusion, I'm going to try to end on something that I think is both my strongest and my weakest point. I'm defending that it's reasonable to reject the Catholic Church based on philosophical grounds. So I'm going to commit an informal fallacy here by appealing to authority. I think that this should give somebody pause and like really consider my points, but under no circumstances should somebody take this point as like definitive proof that they're like, hey, look, some PhDs agree with me, therefore I must be right. Okay, that being said, more philosophers are nominalists than are realists, at least according to the 2020 Phil Paper survey. 42.85% of philosophers are nominalists, 38.38% are Platonists. And then 8.36% are agnostic on the issue. 5.74% accept some alternate view, and I imagine that those alternate views include the Thomistic style people, the moderate realists. Only 5% are moderate realists, which I think is it was super interesting. And then there's like another 5% that think that the question was unclear. So if you do want to argue that it's unreasonable to reject Catholicism based on at least nominalism, for instance, then I think kind of what you're arguing is that 42.85% of philosophers are not reasonable people. again, this is a fallacy. Like, this argument that I'm making is an appeal to authority. So this point here that I'm making is not knocked down by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think this should give somebody pause, because if you are positing that 42.85% of philosophers are irrational, I'm going to look at you funny and think like, well, maybe it's not as cut and dry as you think that it is. Okay, I couldn't find great data on the mereological nihilism or teleology in terms of like how accepted those views are in philosophy today. I think because they're kind of niche. But that same Phil paper survey that I listed states that 67% of philosophers actually accept or lean towards atheism. And I mean, maybe atheistic Catholics is the next frontier for our friends, the Jesuits. But until then, I think that the Catholic would need to argue that 2/3 of all philosophers are irrational to reject Catholicism through their atheism. That's going to be it for me. Thank you for listening. David, I look forward to hearing your response, and then I look forward to doing the back and forth after. So that's it for me.
Thank you for that. That was worth listening to. I didn't know what to expect because I didn't really prepare, and I didn't really look into what you told me that you were going to talk about. So it was very refreshing to hear it. And these are very important issues that are near and dear to my heart as a student of philosophy, an amateur student of philosophy.
Oh, and I'll raise my amateur hand as well.
Yeah. But yeah, it's one of the most disturbing topics in all of philosophy is the whole question of nominalism versus not universalism, but whatever the alternative is. And I haven't prepared anything. I'm going to respond to some of the notes that I took here, and then we're going to go back and forth. So yeah, is it reasonable to reject the teachings of the church, in particular the philosophical teachings of the Catholic Church? The answer is clearly no, because of the dogmatic teaching about the existence of God. We can know with reason, with pure reason, without recourse to any faith-based beliefs, that God exists. And so this is a philosophical teaching of the church. It's a dogmatic teaching of the church. And it's also a dogma that we can know in particular through causality. And there are many proofs out there. If you want to Google it, you can look it up. And we're not going to get into the actual proofs unless you want to later. But I mean, from my Catholic point of view, you've already lost this informal debate, because it's just a fact that the contingent implies the necessary. Game over. So there is God, there is monotheism. And then the whole question about Christianity being true, that's a question of history. And then of the Catholic Church being the fullness of Christianity, that's a question of authority. So, I mean, really what I think is it's not reasonable to reject the philosophical teachings of the church from an atheist perspective. And that's your perspective right now, or you're some sort of agnostic or atheist. Is that right?
Yeah, I call myself an agnostic.
Okay. So I think I think that monotheism is the case, and it's not reasonable to reject monotheism. Now, is it reasonable to reject Christianity once you're a monotheist? Well, yeah. I mean, we have to wrestle with the evidence and the confluence of the evidence, and how the motives of credibility add up to a leap of faith, because it is a faith-based religion, Christianity. Monotheism is not faith-based, but Christianity is, Islam is, Judaism is. So if you want to be a particular kind of monotheist, you're going to have to take a leap of faith. So is it reasonable to be a Jew? I think so. Is it reasonable to be a Muslim? I think so. Is it reasonable to be a Christian? I think so. Is it infinitely more reasonable to be a Christian than a Jew or a Muslim? Yes, I think it is. You just need to be educated, need to be open-minded, and these sorts of things. But this is really straying from our point. I'm going to continue on to the next point, where you talked about Occam and nominalism. And, you mentioned transubstantiation, you mentioned natures, and, these are all at the very heart of the debate that's raging on the internet in Catholic circles and in Christian circles, and even, engaging with atheists like Aaron Ra and different people like that about, what's it called? Evolution. So this is, these are very, very, very important issues, because if you speak to an evolutionist, they betray their nominalism very quickly. If you scratch an evolutionist, you will find a nominalist. Okay, that's just the case, because you cannot be an evolutionist if you're a nominalist. So that's another interesting debate we could have later. So just moving on with my notes here, I'm just doing rapid fire, and we're gonna go back and forth and talk about this. But my other note here was about the mereological nihilism, the denial of composite objects, and you mentioned body and soul. I don't want to dwell on this point other than to say that it is a mystery. I mean, it is. I'm very sympathetic to you. When it comes to nominalism, when it comes to mereological nihilism, I'm very sympathetic. I understand how it seems way more intuitive, way more intuitive. Your side seems way more intuitive, but my side, the Catholic side, is more magical. It's more mystical. It's more wonderful. It's, there's mystery. So I have attention. I opt for attention. I opt to keep all of the tension that you see as a negative, I see as a positive. What you see as cognitive dissonance or some sort of tension, internal tension, I see as the mystery. And I want that. I want to keep that. I didn't expect it when I was an atheist, and I just fell in by studying philosophy. I fell into monotheism and then Catholicism. I didn't want tension. I wanted all the tension to be resolved. That's why I was a hard solipsist and, a hard determinist and all those hard things, because I wanted to resolve the tension. But I realized once I became a monotheist that it's better to have the tension and to be able to hold the tension and to have that mystery. Okay, so in terms of teleology, final causality, you mentioned that it ended with Francis Bacon. I would argue Descartes. He's right up there with the big players that put the final nail in the coffin with that, because clearly he's the sort of one of the fathers of modernism, not postmodernism, but modernism, with the scientific materialistic approach to the natural sciences. So I owe a great debt to Descartes, because he brought me out of my hard solipsism. But I also see the shortcomings in his particular approach and his way of thinking, and certainly his theology and his Catholicism. There are shortcomings there that could be pointed out. And all of the things that I give him credit for my conversion out of hard solipsism and along with that atheism, all the credit that I give him actually goes through him back to St. Augustine, my real hero, because it turns out that even the cogito was taken from, knowingly or unknowingly, was taken from St. Augustine, who said it centuries earlier. So there's another point you mentioned about potential. This is a key word. You didn't use the word potential, actually, but you just talked about the acorn and the oak and how these things develop. I forget what word you used, but potential is the word I would use. And this is another key word that is absolutely essential to understand if atheists and monotheists are going to sit down and have a serious talk about evolution versus special fiat creation. Potential, very, very, very important. And we're going to get into that possibly today or possibly another day. I did want to mention, though, what came to mind as you were speaking about teleology and sex, the morality of sexuality, was, a lot of people point to sexuality in the lower animals, or the beasts as they're sometimes called, and they point out the aberrant behavior, masturbation, homosexual activity, and these sorts of things. That is not sinful. It's a type of sin. It's a type in the hermeneutic sense of the word, where we're talking about types and antitypes. So it's symbolic of sin. Like if two apes are sodomizing each other for pleasure, that's not sin. It's not sin. But it points to sin. It reminds us about our sin. When humans engage in that, it is sinful, right? So there's a big difference, because, because nominalism is not the case, we have this knowledge that we have a human nature and we have free will, we have reason, and the lower beasts don't. And they're from the atheistic, secular, evolutionist point of view, there's no difference between an ape and a human. We are apes, and what's moral for them is moral for us, and what's immoral for them is immoral for us. So I just wanted to emphasize that there's a quantum leap difference between sexual morality in animals, lower animals, which doesn't exist at all, and then sexual morality in humans, which does exist. So that, to account for that, we're going to have to reject nominalism. And then the final thing that you mentioned was sort of the fact that in academia, at least, the philosophers tend to be the largest group, I guess you were saying, is they tend to be nominalists, at least those who were surveyed. And that doesn't really, I don't really have much to say about that, other than the fact that, you know, the truth is not something that we get by consensus or by having the numbers. And I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, and you basically already acknowledged that it's not a super strong argument. It's just something food for thought, and it is food for thought. But when I chew on that food for thought, I'm thinking more about the percentages of the relative populations in heaven versus hell. That's what I think about. You know what I mean? Thinking about people going astray in the broad way to hell, and how easy and fun it is being on the highway to hell, and how narrow and difficult it is to go to heaven. So that's just to sort of give my reactions to some of the notes that I made while you gave your talk. So now we can open it up and go back and forth and have an organic back and forth in terms of the points that I responded to, and in terms of the things that you think are important that I didn't make notes about and that I didn't respond to. So I'll let you talk now.
Okay, cool. CJ asked a question that actually is kind of like, it's going to lead into my first question for you. And that is, are there many nominalistic theists, and in which tradition do they reside? So I can't actually answer the question of are there many, but I can answer the question of are there any? And the answer is yes, there are. And there's at least more than like one. So Dr. Kenny Boyce is a philosopher, a PhD philosopher at University of Notre Dame or something like that. He is a Protestant and he is a nominalist. And nominalism is actually like pretty central to the Protestant tradition. Martin Luther himself, in some ways, was a nominalist. Why do I bring this up, though? And what does this have to do with like my first question for you, Dave? So I think that you said something to the effect of you were drawing like parallels between evolution and nominalism and stuff like that. And the way that I see it, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, evolution kind of doesn't factor into anything here for me. And the reason I say that is because somebody can be a nominalist and still reject evolution if they so choose. And the reason I say this is because like they just kind of appear to me to be pretty different. And oh, here comes Angus. And so I just think that like evolution to me is kind of neither here nor there. And it's possible that I just misunderstood the point that you were trying to make. So let me ask you, what do you think about the idea that like nominalism and evolution are kind of, I mean, related in some ways, in the sense that like I bet you that most people who do accept evolution, that's actually probably not even true. I was going to say I bet you that most people who accept evolution are nominalists, but there's like a whole bunch of theistic, there's like a lot of Catholics accept evolution. And I don't think that most Catholics are nominalists. Forgive me. So just wondering your thoughts there.
Yeah, that's why I emphasized the secular evolutionists, the atheist evolutionists, and the theistic evolutionists have got one foot in both camps, and that's sort of cognitive dissonance that is sort of not good. You know, it's not the beauty and the mystery and that good tension that I'm hoping to reside in. It's the genuine contradiction that we should shun. I think, and this is not to insult any of my friends who are theistic evolutionists, but and by friends I mean fellow humans. But no, the idea is that if you take evolution seriously and you're not invoking miracles at every step like the theistic evolutionists have to do, if they've taken the time to think about what is actually happening and what human nature is versus ape nature. Because there, you know, you can be a lay Catholic and just sort of accept on authority that okay, the church says that it's okay to believe in theistic evolution, so it must be coherent. Well, no, it's not coherent. And you know, if you educate yourself about metaphysics and about you know, natures and these sorts of things that we're talking about today, you'll realize that you're going to have to invoke a lot of miracles to make theistic evolution work, which is fine. You could do that. You could do that. But the distinction that I'm trying to make and that you've asked about is very, very important. It's just sort of to understand the difference between the natural and the supernatural. That's really at the heart. That's really at the heart. When I introduced evolution into this debate, which was maybe not a good idea because it might sideline us a little bit too much, but in any case, we'll deal with it. But at the heart of that is nature versus the natural versus the supernatural, right? So if you're a nominalist, you don't believe in natures, and so you're going to have to invoke miracles. So you could be a theistic evolutionist. But for the atheistic evolutionists, I think that nominalism makes more sense. And I think that your mereological nihilism makes more sense. And so I applaud you for taking that position. I also think that for the atheist, hard determinism makes the most sense. You have to be a hard determinist. I don't know if you are. I can't remember.
I am.
Okay. So you're the right kind of atheist or agnostic in my books. But I don't know if I even answered your question, but you can follow up or you can move on.
No, I think that was really good. And that actually kind of like leads me into the next question, which I think is like perfect. So you asked me if I'm a determinist. I said, yeah, I am. You brought up, and I think really like rightly, you brought up the idea about potentiality.
Yeah.
Potentiality is like you read Aquinas, and I'm going to use a fancy word here. Ontological pluralism is everywhere. What is ontological pluralism? It's this, and I'm saying, I know that you know this, Dave, I'm saying this more for the audience. It's the idea that there's two different modes of being. So there's the things that be, the things that are, the things that exist actually, and there's the things that be, the things that are, the things that exist potentially. Two different ways that things can exist. So some things exist only potentially, some things exist actually. I am not an ontological pluralist. I'm an ontological monist. I think that there's only one way that things exist. That is to say, I think that things only exist actually. And I think that if somebody were to say that they think that something exists potentially, to me, that's the same thing as saying that thing does not exist, at least not at this moment. And I think, I know that kind of sounds like word salad. Like, Kevin, like, why are you bringing this all up? But I think it's actually critical to the conversation. David, you said that the word potential is critical to understand. Yes. Oh my goodness, yes. That was an excellent point. And I think that somebody's stance on ontology might dictate a lot of their other positions. You know, what do you think about that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Excuse me. You know, we hear online people talking about epistemology and ontology and which one's more fundamental and all these sorts of things. Because of my journey, because of my spiritual journey, it's an existential thing. Like, I'm a real person. I went through, I was raised Protestant. I became atheist. I was agnostic. I was pantheist for a while. I've dabbled in all kinds of different philosophies and worldviews. And I ended up being a generic monotheist and then a Catholic. And so, existentially, we tackle ideas. We are confronted with constraints on our free choice, what I believe to be free choice, and we react and we respond and we think and we grow. Okay, and I understand your perspective, I respect your perspective on potential. Like, you just see these changes as inevitable, and I think that's the most reasonable stance you could take if you're not a monotheist. Okay, so I understand the difference between my vision of potential and that ontological plurality versus your monism in that sense, and I respect your position, and I've been there. I've been there. So, I think it's a reasonable place to be. But can you remind me, what am I talking about? What's the answer to the question here?
So I think that I was just kind of asking. Well, actually, no, I don't think I was actually asking something. I think that I was just saying that I agree with you that potentiality is critical. But I didn't get into potentiality per se in my opening statement, but I was kind of touching on it with like teleology, because I think that like a teleological understanding, like a teleological worldview, is one that says that like acorns have the potentiality to grow into trees. And I think that, and I'll argue that like a more accurate worldview is not a worldview which says that like this potentiality exists. I think that a more accurate worldview is such that like the laws of nature will dictate that either this acorn will grow into an oak tree or this acorn will not grow into an oak tree. Like this acorn will get tossed into a fire before it gets planted or whatever. I think of that as just like a more accurate picture of how reality is. What do you think about that? I know you disagree, but you know.
Yeah, I wish I could remember my thread, because I had a point I was making, and then I was going to give a little bit of context in terms of, you know, the development of my understanding as I explored ideas, and I came to it in terms of you know, my understanding today about potentiality and actuality. But you know, the crux of the matter for me, and maybe it'll come back to me, hopefully it'll come back to me, but the crux of the matter for me when I think about nominalism, when I think about mereological nihilism, when I think about hard determinism, all these sorts of issues, and then on the other side, you know, with monotheism, I think about the freedom of the will, and I think about morality, and I think about all the richness on my side. You know, the choice is clear in terms of which one I think is superior, but I understand both positions. But yeah, the potential, the crux of the matter, like I was saying, is basically, you know, do our choices matter? Are we, you know, I guess what we're going to have to get into is morality. I guess this is sort of the background issue in the back of my mind as I'm trying to piece together my ideas here. The basic idea is morality, right? Like, why do our choices matter? Do our choices matter? And I think the reason I'm confused and the reason I'm fumbling is because these are all very, very, very deep and important fundamental philosophical ideas I've been grappling with for a very long time. You know, the question of universals to me is very highly mysterious and highly elusive. And like I said, I sympathize with nominalism. And you know, the concept of free will is so deeply mysterious that I just accept it, and I'm happy and I'm grateful to God to have it, but I don't understand it. Just like the composite nature of like the body and the soul, how does it make sense? It's more intuitive to be on your side of the question, but I'm happy to be on my side of the question. And I'm repeating myself here, but just because these things are so deep, they're so complex, and they've been on my mind for so long, and I'm just sort of happy to be on my side and not on your side, but I want to help you and I want to help the listener. But I feel a little bit frustrated because I can't even put a sentence together when I'm talking about these things which are so deep. But basically, you know, if we think about the issue of morality and from a Catholic perspective, the four last things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, I think that'll bring into sharp relief and sharp focus the reasonableness of rejecting what seems more reasonable, and therefore the reasonableness of accepting the mystery that is on my side. So I think that's maybe a good jumping off point to go deeper into this.
If you don't mind, I'll say just a word about like the mystery part real quick before we jump into morality. And then I'm going to ask a clarifying question about morality real quick. And then we can jump into the finer parts of morality. So just a word. I don't think that you're going to have anything to say because frankly, I'm not even disagreeing with you here. So you talked about mystery and even the word tension and as not a bad thing. I agree. I don't think that mystery is a bad thing. You used the word, there's one word that I'm going to push back on ever so slightly. And that said, so you've got these two worldviews, one that has the mystery of theism and one that does not. And you use the word superior. I'm going to change that word to attractive or perhaps even like pretty. Pretty might be like a derogatory word though, but I think that attractive does a good job explaining this idea. I agree. I do think that theism is more attractive than non-theism. And excuse me while I cough, I'm still getting over a cold. I think that theism is more attractive than my worldview. And I think that's kind of why I held on to my worldview for such a long time, because it is prettier than what I currently am at. Superior, though, is an interesting word. And I don't think that superior is a word that can exist in a vacuum. Superior in what way? Superior in terms of attractiveness? Yeah, sure, I agree. Superior in accuracy to how the world is. Superior in the ways in which it comports with reality. That's where I'm going to push back a little bit, and I think that we can get into that in a moment. But you heard there mostly agreement there. And then one quote from one novel comes to mind. I'm going to bring up novels in a second. There's a book called The Sun Also Rises. At the end of The Sun Also Rises, it ends with this soul-crushing note. The main character very much so wants to be with this girl, but he actually became disabled during World War I, and so he can't have children. And so he says, like, wouldn't it be great if we could be together? And the book ends with her responding, yeah, isn't it pretty to think so? Oh, and that's how the book ends. Oh, if that doesn't make you just want to crawl into a hole and cry, I don't know what will. But sometimes I worry that this whole theism project is just, it's so pretty to think so. And that's like a real concern of mine. Books though, so I brought up The Sun Also Rises. My tattoo sleeve, but it's not a full sleeve yet, I'm working on it. But it's all my favorite books. You can see the beginning of my bookshelf right back there. I'm a huge fan of like fantasy novels, like high fantasy. So obviously The Lord of the Rings, but also Wheel of Time, Stormlight Archive, Mistborn, etc. And I like those books specifically because I think that they fill that kind of like mystery hole in my heart. Like, and I think that humans have this like innate desire for mystery. I don't know why. I've seen some like evolutionary explanations for why humans might have this propensity to desire mystery. I don't know how many of them I buy, but what I do buy is that we have it. We have this desire for mystery. Religion is really good for kind of satiating our desire for mystery, I think. I don't have that though, so I turn to like novels for what I used to turn for religion to, and that kind of fills the mystery hole in my heart. Go ahead.
You know that brain fart I had earlier? One of the brain farts I had earlier?
Oh,
it came back to me. It came back to
Good.
me.
Go. Yeah, take it.
So it's very, I'll wrap it up, put a bow on it really quickly. But basically, I was trying to answer your question when I had my brain fart. The question was about ontology versus epistemology. And when I was talking about my voyage, it was to clarify the context for how I came to understand that ontology is first, it's more foundational than epistemology. So that was just where I was going with that. And the reason is primarily existential, because I understood, I went deep into a false worldview, but a very exposing and confronting worldview, which is hard solipsism, where you're the only being, you're a disembodied mind. And I often describe it as sort of being the god of Buddhism. You're just that one mind. Sad and lonely place to be. And I should note, just so you're aware, that today's Trinity Sunday, and the God is not lonely, he's not sad. But if you're a hard solipsist, you're deluded, you're crazy, and you are sad and lonely. But God is not, because he's a Trinity. There's community in the Godhead. He doesn't need company, he doesn't need creation. I just wanted to make that footnote. But when it comes to my understanding of ontology versus epistemology and how they work together, I have a very profound existential connection to ontology, because I thought I was the I am, of the burning bush, Exodus 3:15. I thought I was that I am. Turns out I was mistaken, and God is the I am, but it got me there, thinking that I was the only being got me there very quickly, thanks again to René Descartes. So yeah, the epistemology builds on the foundation of ontology. What do you say in response to that sort of little personal anecdote about how I came to understand that existentially?
I agree. I think that ontology is kind of like at the the base level of like everybody's worldview, pretty much. And I think that your stance on ontology in large part is going to determine the rest of your views. So I just plain old agree. I don't really have anything to I have nothing substantial to add to that. I thought what you said was really good. I want to do morality with you if you want to do morality with me. But if you don't mind, I'll ask a clarifying question first. And then maybe also I'll say, after morality, do you want to go to Q&A? because
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of good questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So my clarifying question about morality is, I wanted to ask you, hey, so we've been talking a little bit, but something that we haven't discussed yet is like the actual, so I listed, hey, here's 3 things, and for each of these 3 things, here's why they're not compatible with Catholicism, and then here's why I think that they are reasonable to hold. We haven't really discussed why they're reasonable to hold yet, but and I'm asking this clarifying question because I explicitly do not want to put words into your mouth, but I'm going to put words into your mouth right now and then ask you if I did a good job. I think what you're saying is it's not necessarily crazy or irrational for somebody to hold these views, but there are other things that it is more rational to hold these. These are so, and morality is one of those. So it's more rational to be a moral realist and an anti-realist. And if you are going to be a moral realist, then you kind of can't be a nominalist, even though nominalism in a vacuum is kind of reasonable. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Forgive me, I'm
exactly.
getting over a cold.
You know, when I was an atheist near the end there, when I was a hard determinist, there was no morality, and I was perfectly happy because what we perceive as morality is just an experience because of the configuration of matter, energy, and space-time. It just is what it is. That's what the beauty of nominalism is. It's the worldview where it is what it is. Everything is what it is, right? This is what it is, and that other thing that looks like it is what it is. It's not this, it's that, right? So you have a factory churning out billions of grommets, and they all look the same. But this one is what it is, and the one next to it is what it is, and the one next to it is what it is. There are no universals, and just this one is what it is. Like, so that position is very reasonable if you take it in isolation and you don't think about the bigger picture, and you don't think about your mother, and you don't think about your cat, and you don't think about love, and you don't think about, you know, all the things that make us human. If you're willing to bracket that all out, and I'm not saying this to dehumanize you, I was there myself, right? And you can always come back with if someone does level an accusation against you, it's inhuman to be a nominalist or whatever, or to be a hard determinist or whatever. You could always just say it is what it is. Like, this is the configuration, and this is how it is playing out in my neurons, and it's playing out in your neurons a different way, but it's all working out the way it's supposed to be. And there's a certain perfection in your worldview that is attractive. You used that word for, to sort of soften my characterization as superior. Yeah, okay, attractive. Yeah, you see an attraction on my side, I see an attraction on your side. Obviously, I mean, let's just face it, that people will settle on a worldview or a subset of beliefs within a worldview. And this goes down even to food, sports, whatever, like the most menial and silly stuff. They will settle on opinions based on what they find attractive. This is the whole thing about the intellect and the will. You know, the intellect feeds information to the will, and the will decides. Like, that's just the way it is. And we don't need to bring free will into it. That's the beauty of you and I talking, is that we don't need to bring free will into it. We can both enter into each other's hypothesis about free will, and it doesn't really disturb our house of cards. That's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
That's the freedom that we have. That's, I would see that as a freedom that God gives us, a grace that God gives us, where he's not going to force our hands. And you can be a nominalist, you can be a hard determinist, and you can still have a reasonable take on many, many, many things. And your intellect is still informing your will. So yeah, we have a lot of wiggle room, and I don't think that you're crazy. You're certainly not more crazy than I am. You're a little bit insane, but not more than I am. Not more than I am. So yeah, that's what I would say about that. So yeah, I hope you understand what I'm saying here is that there's a beautiful complexity which leaves us a lot of room to play. And I don't think there are many people that are really out of touch with reality and whose decisions aren't connected to the information that they're gathering and committing to their will. So that's just what I would say.
Cool. Do you want to do morality before? I just want to make sure that we leave enough time for Q&A. But I'm
There's
happy.
not too much to say. There's not too much to say about
Okay.
morality because, to me, the first step is, can you understand, like the very first bullet point that I addressed on my notes was about the reasonableness of your position and how it's undermined by the dogma that we can know with certainty without recourse to faith that God exists. So to me, the big takeaway that I'd like you to take away from everything that I said is that, it is reasonable to be a monotheist, and that, I think we should do part two where we talk about monotheism, and we do not talk about Christianity. We do not talk about Catholicism. We only talk about metaphysics and monotheism. So if you're willing to do that, then, maybe at a later date we could talk about morality. But for me, morality is more advanced than we need to go into.
Yeah, sure. I'm more than happy to discuss just kind of like plain old monotheism. Um, to like the arguments that I laid out today had nothing really to do with theism at all, because I think of somebody like Dr. Kenny Boyce, who I mentioned earlier, who is a nominalistic Christian. Um, I think that Dr. Boyce would essentially be able to look at my presentation, agree with every single point that I made, and be entirely unperturbed because he's not Catholic. You know what I mean? Um, so my like everything that we discussed today was strictly, it was like very niche and like Catholic centric kind of. So if we have any non-Catholic Christians who are watching this, they might find themselves agreeing with virtually everything that I said and just being entirely unperturbed. Like, yeah, that's fine, Kevin. I don't care. None of that stuff really impacts me. I'm because I didn't argue against theism at all. And frankly, I don't often argue against theism. I might poke holes in a certain argument that if I think that there's one argument that fails, to be like, well, I think that argument fails, and here's why. Um, and I don't even call myself an atheist as much as I call myself an agnostic because I see arguments on both sides. If you if you forced me to say like which way do you lean further towards, I'd say that I lean closer to atheism than I do theism. But I'm really not opposed to this kind of like almost naturalistically friendly theism, where like this theist concept is kind of like this just whatever the base layer of reality is, like that's what God is. I'm kind of just more or less cool with that. Now that's going to look very different than the God of Abraham, right? Like that's going to be very different than the God that is worshipped by 75% of the global population or whatever. That's probably not true. How many Christians, Jews, and Muslims are there in the world? Half of us? I don't know. Doesn't matter. It's going to look real different than that. But that's why I call myself an agnostic and not an atheist. So I'm more than happy to discuss the theism question. And you might be surprised at how much ground I cede to you. I might be like, yeah, all that stuff sounds great. You know what I mean? Like, I might not put up too much of a fight.
I want to ask you one last question before you do Q&A. I feel a little bit guilty for coming on here and wasting an hour of everyone's time because I didn't push back too much. All I said was your position is very reasonable, and it's more reasonable, and that's where I was, and that's where I would be were it not for the authority of the Catholic Church. So I feel a little bit guilty that there wasn't more unpacking of, sophisticated arguments against nominalism. But from your perspective, what would you say? Because I'm sort of telling you how I feel when I look at your side, but from your perspective, when you think about everything I said in this 1 hour, what's your summary of my position? Why I reject nominalism? What impression did I give you?
Um, so I almost use a word that I don't think is accurate. I'll share the word with you. Presupposition. I don't think that word is quite right. But it's almost like a deference to the authority of the Catholic Church, maybe.
Yeah.
Like and that's not quite the same thing as a presupposition.
No.
But I think that and please correct me, but I'm going to do my best. I think that your stance here is kind of like, yeah, hey, look, I can take a look at the nominalism versus realism debate, and I can think that both of them are reasonable. However, I defer to the authority of the church, and the church makes it clear that realism is the way to go. Therefore, I'm a realist. Is that
Yeah.
kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's basically it. And, the goodies, all the goodies that I get love, I get morality, I get heaven, I get all the goodies. You're just flower
Yeah.
food.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So so I feel a little bit bad we didn't give the listeners a little bit more
Hey.
push and pull, but I think that's what happens when two open-minded guys get together.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Sometimes I think the best kinds of conversations are shockingly not like
Fireworks.
confrontational. You know what I mean? Where
Fireworks.
you know, but I thought this was awesome.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
You want
I
to do
enjoyed
some
it.
Q&A?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, sweet. And if you have questions on your side, feel free just to verbalize them.
Yeah.
I've got a decent number over here. I'm not going to go in any particular order. And David, if it's all right with you, I'm going to start with a question for you from Nick. So Nick's Highlander said, are you Eastern Rite? Because focusing on mystery seems to be a big part of the Eastern Rite.
No, I'm Latin Rite, but I'm married to a Greek Orthodox, but she doesn't practice her faith. But I'm sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to the East. I read the entire Philokalia, and it's one of the most impactful things I've ever read. So I'm very, very sympathetic to the East. I'm just by nature, I'm intuitive and, borderline, mentally ill. So I've got a lot of sensitivity to the other dimensions.
Cool. I've got one from CJ. And I think that this is something that probably you and I can both respond to. So Chris says that he sees a distinction between rational and reasonable. I'm going to think out loud for a second, and then I'm going to invite you to think out loud for a second. I don't know if I can think of a difference off the top of my head from those two words. The prompt that we used for today's discussion was, it is reasonable, or did we say rational? I frankly don't recall. What's the name of this live stream? It is reasonable to reject Catholicism on philosophical grounds. So I said reasonable. I think in my opening statement, I started using the word rational and reasonable like interchangeably. I don't know if I see the same distinction that you do, CJ. So if you want to leave another comment clarifying exactly what you see as the difference between the two, I'd be super keen on getting your thoughts there. David, what are your thoughts?
I have no thoughts. I thought my answer was going to be like yours, but I was Googling it while you were talking. I agree with what you said, but the people that are seeking nuance, and what they say is rational individuals display more abstract characteristics like logic, emotional suppression, and methodical behavior and analytical thinking. That's rational. Whereas reasonable individuals displayed social conscious characteristics like kindness, honesty, fairness, and interpersonal sensitivity. This sounds like a bunch of academic mumbo jumbo where they're trying to make a distinction without a difference to me, because they're just categorizing now with this social stuff versus head stuff, like heart versus head. That's what they're doing. I do not agree with this, but it's just something. It's food for thought. It's one way of answering the question, at least. But the head-heart communication is central. It's a central concern of mine for myself, for my mental health, to have a connection between, intellectual masturbation, for lack of a better word, and an integrated, holistic existential health, where you have the heart involved, and the heart is the center of the person. So there is some validity that I could draw from this mumbo jumbo that I just read to you. What are your thoughts on that, what I just said?
I more or less agree about the distinction without a difference part. And I also don't know if it makes a whole lot of sense to try to differentiate those two words based on like the head versus the heart.
Well, be reasonable. Come on, be reasonable. You're being too rational now.
Being too rational.
You're being too rational. You should be more reasonable.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly. I don't know if I really see the. I don't know if I get it. Maybe I'm just not intelligent enough. I don't know.
You're a guy. You're just a guy.
There you go. There you go. Okay, I've got one from Dry Apologist. So I think that this is aimed at me. So Catechism of the Catholic Church entry number 363 says that it is the soul, which is the entire human person. I wonder how that affects Kevin's positions, since the soul can be viewed as simple. I would like to Google CCC 336 right now, because, and the reason I say that is because I quoted from the Catechism during my opening statement, and I'm going to pull open my opening statement. Did I quote 363?
You did 364.
364. So 364, and I'll read it out loud right now. It says, man, though made of body and soul, is a unity. That seems to me to be saying that man is not just a soul.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me see what CCC 363 says real quick. And if you beat me to the punch, David, by all means. Okay. So I'm going to read it out loud. In sacred scripture, the term soul often refers to human life or to the entire human person, but soul also refers to the inmost aspect of man, that which of greatest value in him, that by which he is most especially in God's image.
Yep.
Soul signifies the spiritual principle in man.
Yeah, so I give my feedback here. So Dry Apologist, I think, is misreading 363 because it clearly said that they use the word soul to mean body and soul, right? Like that's basically what 363 is saying. They sometimes use the word soul to mean the composite thing, which is body and soul. That's how I interpret it. Do you agree with me, Kevin?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too. The first sentence of 363 specifically says that it's in scripture. Sometimes the word is used like that.
Yeah.
But it's just, hey, that's how they used the word back then.
Exactly.
We need to make sure that we're very clear with our terms here. So 364 kind of says like, no, look, even though the word is used differently 2,000 years ago, what we need to make it clear that man is body and soul. Man is not just soul.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
cool.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got some more questions. So CJ says he's curious to know who shares my 3 philosophical objections to Catholicism. Albert Einstein. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I don't know.
Dylan Mulvaney.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Hillary Clinton. No, I have no idea. So it's difficult to kind of answer this question precisely as worded because it's like taking my 3 philosophical objections and then putting them all together. Obviously, a ton of people agree with like the nominalism one. Like Martin Luther, like nominalism was like kind of like the new kid on the street during the time of the Enlightenment. And like Luther was like just at the start of the Enlightenment or whatever, right? Like the Protestant revolt is largely like an outcome of the Enlightenment and like Enlightenment thinking and stuff. And nominalism is the same way. So like, I know I sound like a trad cat here, and look, I grew up trad cat, so I don't know what to say. But the Protestant revolt is largely a product of the Enlightenment, and nominalism is likewise a product of the Enlightenment. And so I think a lot of Protestants probably share that first philosophical objection to Catholicism. At least the Protestants who like read up on, like I'm not saying that you know your average Protestant grandma living in Georgia is going to say, "Oh yeah, I'm a nominalist. That's why I hate Catholics." Like that's definitely not the case. But I think that a lot of like the Protestant intellectual tradition is kind of rooted in nominalism. But to answer your question, CJ, like I don't know a single person, like I haven't pulled this from anywhere. I've kind of like synthesized this kind of stuff from reading various other people, if that makes sense.
I have a question for you, Kevin. Do you think that anyone understands what universals are? Like they believe in them and they understand that which they give assent to intellectually and with their will? Because I believe in universals, but I don't claim to understand. To me, it's a complete mystery, and it's like, don't ask me to explain it, because it just seems like nonsense to me. You know, it seems like mumbo jumbo to me, but I embrace it. Do you think that there are geniuses out there, Catholic saints, who actually grasped, you know, Platonism? They understood, you know, because even Platonism, I love it. I've always loved it, but I haven't understood it or comprehended it. I get the drift of it. I see where he's pointing us, and I love it. But to me, it's the realm of God. It's the realm of mystery. So do you sympathize with my position where it's just sacred, hallowed ground behind the veil up in heaven? Or do you think that I'm just dim of wit, but bright people actually understand universals?
So first of all, I don't think that you're dim of wit. But one thing that I do wonder is, like, if we sat down, like, for instance, the Catholic philosopher Ed Feser,
Yeah.
and we were like, hey, Ed, like, what do you think about universals? Like, have you got it all figured out? I don't know. He might be like, yeah, like, I know what universals are. Like, I know, like, it's, you know what I mean? Like, like, would Ed Feser be as mystical about universals as, for instance, as you are? Like, I don't know. Ed
Huh.
Feser writes about universals fairly objectively.
Okay.
And then also, like, Aquinas wrote about universals pretty objectively as well. And I sometimes jokingly call Feser Diet Aquinas, because I feel like Feser is just making the exact same points as Aquinas, just with in English, instead of in Latin.
Well, with Plato, do you think, I mean, I think he was a genius. I think he was seeing something. But this is the thing about, Plato, he talked about the simile of the line and how intuition is much higher knowledge than, the natural sciences and these sorts of things, and much less opinion, But I think Plato was a genius, but did he grasp what he was conveying to us, or was he just a channeling this divine stuff to us? Like, how did you view that as a Catholic, and how do you view it now? Like, was Plato grasping and comprehending what he was passing on to us?
I'm not going to lie, I never got into Plato as a Catholic. I was very much so Aquinas only.
Ah,
And so I was in, like, the moderate realism school of thought, not the Platonic school of thought.
okay.
And I didn't even really start exploring, like, Platonism until after I was already, like, kind of deconstructed, if I'm being 100% honest.
Okay.
But even then, and this is hot take of the day, I don't think that Plato was as much of a Platonist as, like, modern thinkers will say he was. I think that Plato is fairly moderately real in the same vein as Aristotle and Aquinas.
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I, like, was able to sit down and grill Ed Feser or Plato or Aristotle and was like, how much do you, like, how are you guys just grasping at straws, or do you guys actually understand this abstracta stuff? I don't know what their answer would be.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, if you talk to a Catholic mystic, like, let's say there's someone, she's a lady who's uneducated or whatever, and she's channeling from God, like, genuinely, this vision. She can convey the vision, she could talk about the vision, but if you ask her, she's just like, I don't know, that's just what I saw. Like, that's just what God showed me. So I'm wondering if a lot of people, and theologians included, the great saints, if they're conveying to us something that, they do understand more, obviously, they understand it better than I do, but to a certain extent, it does remain a mystery even for them. And I know this is, something that you won't really be able to take as seriously as I do, or to admire, or to feel a sense of awe when you talk about this possibility that that's what's happening. But just play with the idea. I think it's an interesting concept, that there are things that are not unreasonable, but they're beyond our reason. They're not irrational, but they're beyond our thing. You must be sympathetic to that from your good old days from the Catholic.
I'm very sympathetic to that. And this is the main reason why I don't call myself a plain old naturalist. And it's because I think that there could be things that are simply beyond the pale of human comprehension. And, like, if they are, then I have no method of, like, I have no justification for calling myself a naturalist straight out. Now, I will often call myself a methodological naturalist. And that's because pretty much what I'm saying is, like, hey, as far as human cognition will take us, we have to be naturalists. But we also have to admit where our limits lie, and we have to admit that there are things that we can simply, like, there are things that could be true and that we could never know to be true because it's just beyond the pale.
My friend Mary McCoach in the chat asks, Kevin, what are your thoughts on Jesus as God and man, and his resurrection? Do you have any thoughts on that today, now that you're sort of agnostic?
Yeah, so something that I don't spend a whole lot of time, like, my channel is more philosophical than it is like biblical criticism, But biblical criticism played a large role in my deconstruction. And I lost my belief that Jesus rose from the dead. So I used to think that Jesus definitely rose from the dead. Today, I don't think that Jesus rose from the dead. And we could do a whole like 5-hour live stream just talking about biblical criticism. But to answer your question as succinctly as possible, no, I no longer think that Jesus rose from the dead. And the main reason that I think that is because I don't think that the Gospels are like history. I think of the Gospels as literature. And I think that the epistles are interesting, but the epistles don't convince me that Jesus rose from the dead. So that's kind of like my as short as possible answer there.
Do you mind if I ask another question from my chat?
Yeah, no, go for it. Yeah.
Even though it's to me. It says, Christopher asks, David, what moved you from Kevin's side to where you are today, and what were the stepping stones? Well,
that's a good question.
It was, it was going down the rabbit hole, darker and darker forms of, from a nice guy, sort of pantheistic atheism, agnosticism, to, hardcore atheism, into hard determinism, into hard solipsism, and, atheistic Satanism and the whole thing. And then, but all the while studying Western philosophy, and then just realizing when I was reading René Descartes that that I'm not God, that God is God. And then once you're a monotheist, then you have all those things, all those goodies, as I like to call them. You have a God who's infinite in every perfection, and you have morality, you have free will and reason that's endowed by God. You have the whole package deal. And, you have a physical universe which is well ordered, and you have science, and you have hospitals, and, there are so many documentaries about how the Catholic Church built society with the education, universities, hospitals, everything. And, it all came as a package deal to me, thanks to my philosophical reading, and thanks to the fact that I applied radical doubt and skepticism. And this is what I said to my recent guest, Brendan. I said, I respect you guys that are open-minded and seeking the truth and skeptical and questioning and doubting, because it's radical doubt that brought me to God. And I think it could do the same for you, Kevin. I think it could do the same for my friend Brendan. But there are no two stories that are alike in terms of the journey back to God. But if you don't end up in heaven, you're going to end up in hell, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm praying for you and for all my guests, and first and foremost myself, right? So.
And for the record, I always appreciate that, because imagine what kind of monster you would be if you were like, I don't care if you wind up in hell. Yeah. Like, go to hell, Kevin, I don't care. Like, that'd be awful. Like, that'd be terrible. You know what I
damn
mean?
You to hell, you right. Heathen.
But you telling me that you're praying for me so that I don't wind up in hell is you doing the best possible thing. Like, you are telling me, Kevin, I will the good for you. Yeah. And I want the best possible thing to happen to you. And like, how can I meet that with anything other than just gratitude? You know what I mean? So there are people who might be in similar shoes to me, as in like ex-Catholics, who, like, if a Catholic said, I'm praying for you, they might scoff and say like, oh, don't waste your time. And I think that's like very misguided, because I think that when a Catholic is saying that they're praying for you, I think that Catholic is saying, I will the best for you. I hope the best possible thing that could ever happen happens to you. And I don't know how anybody could be upset at that. So anyway, sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
Appreciate that.
I've got a couple others. One for me, but I'll throw it over to you, though I suspect I know your answer, David. So CJ says, where does your strong commitment to embracing truth come from? So I'm going to be honest with you and tell you it's just a personal preference. That's really it. I don't think that there's like some kind of like imperative to like go after truth as voraciously as I try to. I think that plenty of people choose to live the comfortable lie. And I don't think that what they're doing is like objectively evil or anything like that. It's kind of just preference. I prefer to believe in as many true things as I can, and like, disbelieve in as many false things as I can. But that's just me. So where does it come from? It's just like a personal preference, really. I bet you that David's answer looks a lot different. So David, where does your strong commitment to embracing truth come from?
No, I think it's the same. I have I have siblings and family, and I'm the only one with this predilection, like this predisposition. It's
Huh.
it's like it's a predisposition. I've always had it. You've always had it, right? So
Yeah.
it's part of your nature. It's part of your character. It's part of I would say it's a grace from God, but it's not the only way. It's not the only way where you're consciously seeking truth with your head and your heart, but with your head primarily. It's not the only way. It's not the only way to God. It might not even be the best way to God, but it's my way and it's Kevin's way. And it's
I
my
think
friend
so.
Brendan's way that I interviewed Friday.
Yes. Yes. Um, Question from Nick, and I'll give this a shot, and then I'll see if you want to give it a shot. So, would idealism let a Catholic be a mereological nihilist? I would say something like this: like idealism would let somebody be a mereological nihilist, but I don't think that idealism and Catholicism are compatible with each other. Why? Well, partially because, according to the Catholic Church, um, like human beings are body and soul. So if everything is soul, right? If everything is mental, then we're not body and soul. We're just soul. I don't think that idealism, like I don't think that Catholics can be idealists. Um, so while idealists can be mereological nihilists, I don't think it's true that idealism would let a Catholic be a mereological nihilist, because by adopting idealism, that person would cease being Catholic. Well,
Yeah, yeah,
what is Catholic? Am I still a Catholic? Maybe,
yeah.
technically. All of
Secretly,
that semantic stuff aside, you know what I mean?
secretly Catholic,
Yeah.
praying in your
Well,
closet.
I even just mean like, so I've been baptized and I've never written a letter to the Archbishop of the diocese in which I was baptized asking for my name to be struck from the register. So for that reason, am I still a Catholic? Like officially, the answer might be yes, even though I don't practice. So sometimes when people ask me, "Are you a Catholic?" I'll just cut to the chase. I don't practice. I'm not a practicing Catholic,
That's the
because
most
I feel like that.
honest. That's the most honest and humble answer you can give.
Yeah, that's what I think. Do you have more from yours? Because I've got maybe two more from mine.
No, I've got to wrap it up. So let's do your two, and then we'll
Oh,
wrap it up.
perfect. Well, tell you what.
Because
So there was.
Christopher's wife's coming on my podcast.
Hey, that's awesome. That's awesome. Speaking of Christopher, Christopher says, I suspect that the use of vulgar fictions demonstrates more than just the utility of communication. Don't we experience the fictions, quote unquote, that some philosophers deny, free will specifically? I do think that we have this kind of like self-reflection of experience that I refer to as like speaking with the vulgar, free will specifically. I just think that when you actually look into it, the facts of the matter point to free will not existing, which is why I refer to it as a fiction. But it's something that seems true. So I'll call it, and like I might, since it seems true, I might even speak as if it were true. Like just in a normal, non-philosophical conversation, I might say like, yeah, I decided to go do this. And it's like, well, did you really decide to decide? Like, because you don't have free will. And it's like, look, I'm speaking with the vulgar right now. So that's what I mean there. Any thoughts, David?
Yeah, I mean, there's no winning move against the hard determinist. There's no winning move. Don't worry about it. Just leave them alone.
Yeah.
Because it just all gets integrated into the machine. It's just another cog in the machine. It all fits together perfectly. It's that perfection that I mentioned that you have that I do respect and admire. I think you're wrong, but I do understand that it's a perfect system and everything's integrated. And you can play along, you can speak colloquially, you can do the double speak, and I don't think it's a big deal if you use the double speak and use loose colloquial language, sure.
Yeah. I just want to point out that Nick liked the fact that I said Protestant revolt and not revolution. CJ, I'm so sorry. I'm a product of my upbringing, and I say Protestant revolt when I'm not actively thinking about saying Protestant Reformation, and that's because I grew up Tradcat, and I don't know what to tell you, other than I'm sorry if I offended anybody. I'm sorry if I offended my Protestant friends, but Protestant revolt is just how I say Protestant Reformation, because that's how I grew up.
Well, there's nothing wrong with revolting. Like, I mean, when there's corruption, I revolt against the corruption. And that's what the Protestants, who are proud of what they perceive to be a revolt against corruption, are proud of, right? So I don't think we need to get all excited about this word. It's a good word, and I'm revolted. I'm revolted by the evils in the church today, right?
Yeah.
So I'm in revolt. I am in revolt.
Good.
I'm in revolt.
I like that. That's a very
Let's
good
embrace
point.
it. Let's embrace the word revolt.
That was an awesome point. Last thing, CJ says, I wish you wonderful tacos. Truly. Thank you, CJ. I wish you wonderful tacos as well. That's all I had, David. If I was going to end with like a single sentence, it would be, so on yesterday's live stream with your new friend, oh my goodness, what's his name? Brendan. You said something to the effect of like, I'm glad when people join the Catholic Church, and I'm also glad when people leave the Catholic Church, because I think it's better to like pursue truth than it is to like just kind of remain Catholic and like kind of be like this insidious like tumor almost inside the church. And like, and I just wanted to say that that like really spoke to me, and I think that was like an awesome point. And I just thought it would be cool for you and I to end on a point of agreement. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that and say that you and I agree 100% there, that like pursuit of truth is more important than staying where you are because you're afraid of like offending people or something like that.
Absolutely. Agree 100%. That's why people like us get along. And that's why I sent an email to you and Brendan thinking maybe you could have him on your show. So hopefully he'll get in touch with you and you'll hook that up. I'd like to hear how you guys, what you guys have to say to each other.
Yeah. And I think that we will. I think Brendan and I will get together at some point. It's just a matter of,
scheduling.
Yeah, exactly. But David, this was awesome. Thank you so much for doing this with me. I had a blast. And hey, we should do this again sometime too. There's so much left to discuss, obviously.
Yeah, well, I'd like to make a proposition to you that we attack and examine the modal proof of Blessed John Duns Scotus, because it's an a posteriori proof of the existence of God, which is a formal demonstration according to the strict norms of Aristotle. And so I'll send you a couple of links. You can decide if you're interested.
Let's do it.
But you seem like the kind of person that's interested in digging in deep and taking a deep dive into some pretty philosophical topics. And I was impressed, listening to your 15-minute introduction or whatever it was, your opening statement, because just because of the way that you approach these very, very difficult subjects. And I'm sorry, like I said, I'm sorry I didn't give more substantial rebuttals, but I don't have much to say. And but when it comes to the modal proof of the existence of God, I think we can have a little bit more push back and forth. And I'll send you those links after this, okay?
Let's do it. That'd be awesome.
Take good care. I love you lots, and God bless you.
Love you too, brother. This was awesome, and can't wait for the next one.
We'll talk soon.
All right.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Okay.